And I'm Allie Cole. I'm from the finance group, and I'm looking forward to telling you about my job market paper, which is about how workers value the retirement benefits offered by their employer. And this is joint work with Bloody Tasca, who is at Lightcast. So in recent years, there has been increased spending on and participation in defined contribution or DC retirement plans by employers. So here I'm talking about accounts like 401ks and 403bs. So much so that as of 2019, corporations spent about $170 billion each year in contributions to these accounts, and about 2/3 of firms offered one of these accounts to their employers. At the same time, these accounts are an essential component of household wealth formation. So for the average household, about 2/3 of their non-housing wealth is in retirement accounts. So understanding both how these accounts are administered by corporations and used by workers is essential to our understanding of both household and corporate finance. Now, there's a standard view in academic household finance that these accounts don't really seem to matter all that much for saving, and there's not really any evidence on whether or not they affect where people choose to work or how they move around between jobs. And that's what's shown in this quote from a literature review on the topic by James Choi and co-authors. Workers don't seem all that sensitive to the features of these plans and their saving. Now, at the same time, there's this view in HR that these accounts are really, really important as a recruiting tool. And that is what is shown in these headlines that I've selected from the news over the past couple of years, that especially when we've been in a very tight labor market, corporations and in particular HR departments seem to think that these accounts are really, really important for attracting workers. So we have something of a paradox here. There's this view in the academic literature that these accounts aren't all that important, but then by revealed preference on the corporate side, as they continue to spend money on them and offer them, they clearly seem to matter on some dimension. So in this paper, I'm going to address this paradox by showing first that workers actually do value these accounts quite highly relative to wages, and that they do affect where people choose to work. So the question I'm answering here is, how do workers value the retirement portion of compensation, specifically relative to wages? So there are three challenges. First is data. I need data that links together information on wages, retirement plans, and worker mobility across jobs. This data does not exist in any format that's readily available to a PhD student, so I created it. So I built a data set combining from several different sources to combine wages from the near universe of job postings, resumes covering about 1/3 of the US workforce, and then firm level retirement plan financials from regulatory filings. I'm also going to supplement this with hand collected survey data. The second challenge here is one of endogeneity and omitted variables. So let me be a little more specific about what I mean. There's been a variety of evidence that I cite here that wages and benefits tend to be correlated within the firm. So firms that have higher wages also tend to offer better benefits. In addition, a lot of those benefits are not measurable. So it might be something like, how nice is your office? Or what's your commute like? Or do you like your coworkers? So these are things that I, as the econometrician, am not going to be able to measure. So to address this concern, I have a twofold approach. First is I'm going to have two instruments, one that uniquely affects wages and one that uniquely affects retirement. And then I'm going to have a series of survey experiments where I can more directly control for differences between firms. So the last challenge is that the answer to this question depends on the equilibrium of wages and benefits offered. So workers aren't just considering the level of compensation at one job, they're considering the entire distribution of compensation bundles at any potential employer where they may work. So to address this, I'm going to have a structural model of on-the-job search that's going to control for the competitive frictions between firms that affect the level of compensation. And within the framework of that model, I can do some firm policy simulations that are going to account for both the competitive frictions and the regulatory constraints that firms face when they're designing retirement plans. So in my remaining time, I'm going to very quickly go through the main results from each of the three parts of the paper, starting with the instrumental variables, and then I'll talk a little bit about the survey evidence and the model if time permits. So my first instrument, as I said, I'm going to have two, one that affects retirement and one that affects wages. The first instrument is non-discrimination testing of retirement plans. So this is an IRS-mandated test that the majority of firms that offer a retirement plan have to pass each year. The purpose of the test is to show that their retirement plan does not disproportionately favor highly compensated employees. So it's kind of complicated, but in a nutshell, what it is that your highly compensated employees cannot have an effective contribution rate that's too much higher than your non-highly compensated employees, and that's inclusive of any matching or non-elective dollars that the employer gives to the plan. Failure of this test is actually quite costly. It's costly for two reasons. One is, it's costly because you have to fix it. And you can fix it in two ways. One is you can give more contributions to your non-highly compensated employees. This is a financial outlay for you as a firm. The second way you can fix it is you can claw back contributions from your highly compensated employees. That may not be a financial cost for you as a firm, but it's an administrative cost. And you now have likely disgruntled, highly paid employees who now have money that they thought was tax deferred that's no longer going to be tax deferred. If you don't fix it in one of these ways, you have to pay an excise tax, and then your plan is put into a corrective program by the IRS. So despite the fact that it's costly, failures is not all that uncommon. About 10% of firms in my sample fail each year. And after failure, if these firms don't want to fail again, they need their non-highly compensated employees to contribute more. And I'm going to show that the way they do this is by increasing their own generosity of contributions into the plan. So here I'm showing a simple event study plot comparing firms that fail to firms that don't fail, controlling for size and an industry by year fixed effect. The outcome variable here on the y-axis is the ratio of the employer's contributions to all contributions. So this is just a kind of a crude measure of plan generosity. And then the x-axis is tracking time before and after NDT failure. So as you can see, before failure, the firms that ultimately fail have a lower ratio of contributions, so they have less generous plans by about 2 to 3% relative to the non-failers. And then after they fail, they increase their ratio of contributions to be more on par with the firms that did not fail. So this serves as something of an exogenous shock within the firm to the generosity of the retirement plan. My second instrument is going to affect wages. So for this, I'm going to use a phenomenon identified in a working paper by Joe Hazel and co-authors that about 30 to 40% of firms set wages nationally. What this means is that they pay workers in the same occupation, but different locations, the same wage. So they might pay a lawyer in Cambridge the same as a lawyer in Tucson, despite the differing labor market conditions between those two cities. Firms that do this also tend to have higher wages overall, but they don't have significantly different retirement contributions or healthcare spending. And so this is just the results of a simple cross-sectional regression showing the outcome variable on the x-axis regressed on a dummy equal to 1 if the firm follows this policy, controlling for size and industry by year fixed effects. So these firms have about 2.3% higher wages, but again, not significantly different contribution rates or healthcare spend. I'm going to use this to construct an instrument that is going to vary over time within the firm that measures the amount of the wage, the amount of the variation in the wage that's coming specifically from the firm being a national wage setter. So then using these two instruments, I'm going to run a regression I'm going to skip this because I'm short on time. But the regression is going to measure the firm's recruiting success within a firm job and occupation over time. So for example, does Google get better at recruiting software engineers in Houston as their wage or their retirement change over time? So here are the main results from this instrumental variables regression. So I'm showing here, again, the y-axis is the outcome variable, which is the firm's recruiting success in a specific occupation and location. The green is the effect from an increase in the employer contribution rate, and the orange is the effect from an increase in the wage. So on the full sample of occupations here, we see that the employer contribution rate has about twice the effect as the wage in magnitude on the firm's recruiting success. They're both positive and significantly different from zero, so workers are sensitive to both wage and retirement, but at least in the magnitude, they're more sensitive to retirement. Then if we look at some subsamples here, for example, comparing high-income occupations to low-income occupations, the high-income workers are much more sensitive to retirement. They're about 3 times as sensitive to retirement relative to wages, whereas the low-income workers are a bit more sensitive to wage. And then you see a similar dynamic there if you compare the high age versus the low age occupations. So what we see here is there's a lot of heterogeneity in this effect. Workers on average are a bit more sensitive to retirement, but that's driven by higher income and higher age workers, whereas lower income and lower age workers are in fact more sensitive to wages. So then I'm going to supplement this with some survey evidence. So what I do here is I'm going to show workers side-by-side job offers in which the only elements that differ are the wage and the retirement benefits offered. So for example, here I am estimating the willingness to pay for a 3% match conditional on having a 401k. So the higher paying job, job 1 in this case, has a slightly higher salary and a 401k but with no employer match. And then I have a lower paying job that offers a 401k and a 3% match. I'm going to vary the salary in the lower paying job in downward increments so that I can then measure the willingness to pay by participants in the survey for this benefit. Showing the main results for this condition here, the y-axis is the share that choose the job with the employer match, and the x-axis is the wage premium for the job with the employer match. So focusing now on the people to the left of the black line at 0, which is people who were shown the condition like I showed you in the in the example that the job with the benefit paid less, about 71% choose the job with the match even when it pays a lower wage. Their implied willingness to pay is about 4.3% of wages. So they'll give up about $1.50 of wage to get an extra dollar of employer matching. Okay, so I only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to just zip through the model really quickly. So the model is going to be an on-the-job search model where workers are, having job offers come in as they're working, and they're going to evaluate that new job offer versus their current job and then choose where to go. And they're going to have weights that they place on the different components of compensation, and these weights are what I'm going to measure by looking at the net flows of workers between employers and then the differences in wages, retirement, and healthcare that I measure in the data. So that's how I can identify the weights. So I see people moving from A to B and people moving from B to A. So using those differences, I can identify the weights that workers place on compensation. So the main results are consistent with what I've shown in the IV and the survey. The majority of workers, 75%, are willing to give up some pay to get a higher employer contribution rate. And this means that most firms in my sample could do better on the recruiting dimension if they increased their retirement contributions. To quantify this, let's ask the question, what's the effect of a single firm increasing its wage or its retirement by an equivalent dollar amount pre-tax to the firm? And here I plot the effect on hiring. The blue is from a 1 percentage point increase in the employer contribution rate. The green is from an increase in the wage. And again, those are pre-tax dollar equivalents to the firm. So the retirement is going to have a much larger effect than the wage because of the high value that workers place on it. It's about 2.5 times as large as the effective wage. Think about the cost of this to the firm. If you think only about the flow cost for new hires, it's about the same cost. Again, I said these are pre-tax dollar equivalents to the firm. There is a slight tax wedge, which is why the retirement is actually a bit cheaper. So if you're looking at this as a firm, it's clear what you should do. Obviously, retirement is going to get you more bang for your buck. However, because of that non-discrimination testing that I described briefly earlier, if you increase retirement for new employees, you have to increase it for your existing workforce as well. So if you account for that cost, the cost of increasing retirement skyrockets, and it's now orders of magnitude larger than increasing the wage. This is, of course, like an extreme, assuming that you can increase wages for new workers without increasing wages for others, but it illustrates the point that regulation prevents firms from being able to use retirement as much as they might like as a recruiting tool. So let me sum up, sorry for going a little bit over, but I find across 3 methods that workers place a really high value on DC retirement plans. They're about twice as sensitive on average versus wage dollars, and higher income and higher age workers are the ones who are really driving this. They're quite sensitive to retirement. Survey results verify that the majority are willing to give up at least some pay to get a higher employer contribution rate. And the same is true in the model, but then I show that because of the regulatory frictions, firms might like to use retirement even more in order to increase their recruiting power, but regulations make large changes to retirement plans prohibitively costly. Okay, thank you.